It's time for Agriculture, presented by Turkana Farms in Germantown, New York, a small-scale producer of heritage breed livestock and a wide array of vegetables and berries on just over 39 acres. They also produce a full array of garden vegetables, many of them heirloom varieties raised naturally, as well as an assortment of berries, including raspberries, blackberries, gooseberries, black, red, and white currants, mulberries, and elderberries. And now, here's Mark Scherzer.
The news is understandably still full of stories about the January 6th insurrection at the Capitol. Investigators want to know how much was planned ahead and orchestrated by leaders, and how much resulted from spontaneous combustion of the crowd. Historians have similarly parsed other episodes of communal violence, whether localized like the Tulsa Massacre of 1921 or the Wilmington, North Carolina Massacre of 1898, or on a massive scale like the genocidal ethnic cleansing in Rwanda, Bosnia, and of course the Holocaust. The conclusions are always complex. There are always organizers, provocateurs, and goaders, and there are those who never would have planned to do what they did, maybe even regretted their actions, but were carried away by being part of a group in the moment. Recognizing the complexity of human motivation and how fluid the boundaries are between our individual senses of purpose and our desires to be part of our group, our legal system will expend significant resources trying to figure out who was a leader and who was a follower or unwitting collaborator on January 6th. The examination is critical in determining who to charge with a crime and what crime is charged. It's how we assess blame and signal to other members of our society how we have to behave. Shouldn't we assume that our animal cousins share a similarly complex range of motivations? I keep coming across animal studies in the popular press, like the article in this week's New York Times entitled "Goats Don't Vote," which suggest otherwise, that each species has one predominant mode of decision-making. This week's article was based on a study in Wales of a herd of goats on which GPS tracking devices had been placed. It suggested that the primary way goats make herd decisions about where to move is to simply copy what other goats do. The scientists reached this conclusion because the tracking devices showed that the goats did not orient themselves to face in the same direction before moving, which, they said, they would have done if a discussion of some sort had preceded the decision and a vote taken. To me, this seems scant evidence on which to base such a conclusion, but when you observe such a thin slice of behavior, I guess you don't have much else to go on. The article linked to previous articles, such as one called "Sneezing Dogs, Dancing Bees: How Animals Vote," which described species, including meerkats and honeybees, where sounds or dances preceded a group move. The meerkats would mew when they thought it was time to go. When enough of their compatriots mewed back, the group would move. Essentially, the group voted or reached consensus. I suspect that the reality of group decision-making for any species is far more complex than the terms vote or copy would convey. Even with sheep, who are so herd-oriented that we describe people who just go along with groupthink as behaving like sheep, I observe all sorts of aberration from the sheepish norm every day at feeding time. It's impossible with a group of animals that crave grain the way I crave chocolate to distribute handfuls of feed into individual feed bowls while they're standing there with me. I need to clear the sheep from at least a portion of the barn in order to place the feed without pandemonium ensuing. I've tried to teach them to cooperate in that process with some predictable signals. I turn on the overhead lights in the barn, which these gray low days creates an immediate change in their environment. Then, as I enter the barn, I start clapping my gloved hands. Usually, but not always, they understand this signal and start moving for the exits. On nice days, they'll either go out the open east or south barn doors. On days of inclement weather, when they prefer not to go out, they at least move to the barn's south vestibule, where I can close them out of the rest of the barn. Usually the lights and clapping suffice to produce movement, but sometimes the group will just look at me, seeming to look right through me, and stand their ground. And if one or two don't go, none will go. So I have to move around, clap my hands more, and bellow, "Outside, outside," sometimes resorting to pushing a few in the right direction. While the majority of the group is likely to follow the first few, it's not universal. It's inevitable that Sophie, the youngest of our bottle-fed ewes, instead of following the group, will approach to sniff my pants and be petted. In contrast, the troublemaking ram, Nazim, before he was sent off to auction a couple of weeks ago, would take the opportunity to charge me. When I first entered the barn and the space between me and him was occupied like a crowded subway car by a sea of ewes, such an aggression was impossible. But once the group moved, the field was open to him, and following the crowd was never as important to him as showing his dominance. Meanwhile, Nilofer, Aisha, and Pepsha, my dearest ewes, would almost always hang back from following the group, hoping their special bonds with me would give them some sort of first dibs on the grain treat. On days when they all go to the vestibule, I sometimes forget to close the east door of the barn. When the ground is snow-covered, I assume they'd rather not walk around to come back through that door. But there's one ewe, number 45. She's known by her ear tag number because we sold her to another farm years ago, and when they decided to stop raising sheep and returned her to us, we had forgotten her name. But also because after our last president, I can barely stand to enunciate the name of any being numbered 45. She has always proved to be rather resourceful and intelligent and sneaky. She will inevitably move from the vestibule out to the south pasture, through the fence to the east pasture, and sneak back through the barn door to get first access to the grain. I've noticed in the last week that a second yearling ewe has learned to follow her, leaving the entire rest of the herd behind. From this, I deduce that movement by one or two sheep, at least these two, is insufficient to induce copying by the rest of the herd. And for their part, those two sneaky sheep care far less about remaining part of the herd than about their greed for grain. Thus, even in animals, pigeonholed as the most herd-oriented in the animal kingdom, it seems there is significant individual variation in priorities, motivations, intelligence, and decision-making. They may not be as smart as us, but they're smart enough to be good or evil, loners or group-oriented, and to have appetites for different satisfaction. As we try to understand animal behavior, the individual variations, too, deserve examination.
Agriculture is underwritten by Turkana Farms, LLC, a small-scale producer of heritage-bred livestock and a wide array of vegetables and berries on just over 39 acres in Germantown, New York. More information, 518-537-3815.